Hi friends, welcome back to our chapter reading. Today we are continuing with The Trumpet of the Swan by E.B. White. When we left off last time, Louis had rescued a friend, Applegate, from drowning in the pond. So let's pick up with chapter 13. Chapter 13 is called End of Summer. A trumpet that has 3 little valves. They are for the fingers of the player. They look like this. This is a picture of a trumpet. And these are the 3 valves. By pushing them down in the right order, the player can produce all the notes of the musical scale. Louis had often examined these 3 little valves on his horn, but he had never been able to use them. He had the 3 front toes on each foot, but being a water bird, he had webbed feet. The webbing prevented him from using his 3 toes independently. Luckily, the valves on a trumpet are not needed for bugle calls, because bugle calls are just a combinations of do, mi, and sol, and a trumpeter can play do, mi, and sol without pressing down any of the valves. That's good to know. If I could just work those 3 valves with my 3 toes, he said to himself, I could play all sorts of music, not just bugle calls. I could play jazz, I could play country and western, I could play rock, I could play the great music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Sibelius, Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Brahms, everybody. I could really be a trumpet player, not just a camp bugler. I might even get a job with an orchestra. The thought filled him with ambition. Louis loved music, and besides, he was already casting about for ways of making money after camp was over. Although he enjoyed life at Camp Cuckoo's Goose, Louis often thought of his home on Upper Red Rock Lake in Montana. He thought about his parents, his brothers and sisters, and about Serena. He was terribly in love with Serena, and he often wondered what was happening to her. At night, he would look up at the stars and think about her. In the late evening, when the big bullfrogs were calling tronk across the still lake, he would think of Serena. Sometimes he felt sad, lonely, and homesick. His music, however, was a comfort to him. He loved the sound of his own trumpet. Summer passed all too quickly. On the last day of camp, Mr. Brickle called his counselors together and paid them what he owed them. Louis received $100, the first money he had ever earned. He had no wallet and no pockets, so Mr. Brickle placed the money in a waterproof bag that had a drawstring. He hung his money bag around Louis's neck, along with the trumpet, the slate, the chalk pencil, and the life-saving medal. He's getting a lot of things around his neck. Louis went to Sam Beaver's tent and found Sam packing his things. Louis took off his slate and pencil. I need another job, he wrote. Where should I go? Sam sat down on his bed and thought for a while. Then he said, Go to Boston. Maybe you can get a job with the Swan boat. Louis had never been to Boston, and he had no idea what the Swan boat was, but he nodded his head. Then on his slate he wrote, Do me a favor? Sure, said Sam. Take a razor blade and slit the web on my right foot so I can wiggle my toes. He held out his foot. Why do you want to wiggle your toes? Asked Sam. You'll see, wrote Louis. I need my toes in my business. Sam hesitated. Then he borrowed a razor blade from one of the older counselors. He made a long, neat cut between Louis's inner toe and middle toe. Then he made another cut between Louis's middle toe and outer toe. Does it hurt? Louis shook his head. He lifted his trumpet, placed his toes on the valves, and played Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Honk! Sam grinned. The Swan boat will hire you, all right, he said. You're a real trumpeter now, but with your web cut, swimming will be harder for you. You'll have a tendency to swim in circles because your left foot will push better than your right foot. I can manage, wrote Louis. Thanks very much for the surgery. Next day, the campers left. The canoes had been hoisted into racks in the boathouse. The float had been hauled onto the beach. The windows of the lodge had been boarded up against bears and squirrels. Mattresses had been packed into zipper bags. Everything was snug and ready for the long, silent winter. Of all the campers, only Louis stayed behind. His flight feathers were growing fast, but he still couldn't fly. He made up his mind that he would remain at camp all alone until he was able to take to the air again, and then he would fly straight to Boston. Here's a picture of Louis playing his trumpet. The lake was lonely without the boys, but Louis didn't mind being alone. For the next 3 weeks, he took life easy. He grew his flight feathers, dreamed of Serena by day and by night, and practiced his trumpet. He had listened to music all summer. Several of the boys had radios and record players, and now he practiced the songs on his trumpet. Every day he got better and better. One day he composed a love song for Serena and wrote the words and music on his slate. Oh, ever in the greening spring, by bank and bough retiring, for love shall be sorrowing, and swans of my desiring. He was really thinking of Serena, but he left her name out of it and kept it impersonal. His plumage was beautiful now, and he felt great. On the 21st of September, he tried his wings. To his great relief, they lifted him. Louis rose into the air. The trumpet banged against the slate knocked against the money bag. The life-saving metal clinked against the chalk pencil, but Louis was airborne again. He climbed and climbed and headed for Boston. It was wonderful to be in the sky again. Flying is a lot harder than it was before I acquired all these possessions, thought Louis. The best way to travel really is to travel light. On the other hand, I have to have these things. I've got to have a trumpet if I'm to win Serena for my wife. I've got to carry this money bag to hold the money to pay for my father's debts. I've got to have the slate and pencil so I can communicate with people. And I ought to wear the medal because I really did save a life, and if I didn't wear it, people might think I was ungrateful. On and on he flew toward Boston, which is the capital of Massachusetts, and which is famous for its baked beans, its codfish, its tea parties, its Cabots, its Lowells, its Saltonstalls, and its swan boats. Chapter 14, Boston. Louis liked Boston the minute he saw it from the sky. Far beneath him was a river. Near the river was a park. In the park was a lake, and in the lake was an island. On the shore was a dock, and tied to the dock was a boat shaped like a swan. The place looked ideal. There was even a very fine hotel nearby. Louis circled twice, then glided down and splashed to a stop in the lake. Several ducks swam up to look him over. The park was called the Public Garden. Everybody in Boston knows about it and goes there to sit on benches in the sun, to stroll about, to feed the pigeons and the squirrels, and to ride the swan boat. A ride cost 25 cents for grown-ups, 15 cents for children. After a short rest and a bite to eat, Louis swam over to the dock and climbed out on the shore. The man who was taking tickets for the swan boat ride seemed surprised to see an enormous white swan wearing so many things around his neck. I think that would surprise me as well. "Hello," said the boatman. Louis lifted his trumpet. "Caw-honk," he replied. At the sound, every bird in the park looked up. The boatman jumped. Boston residents as far as a mile away looked up and said, "What's that?" Nobody in Boston had ever heard a trumpet or swan. The sound made a big impression. People eating a late breakfast in the Ritz Hotel on Arlington Street looked up from their food. Waiters and bellboys said, "What's that?" The man in charge of the swan boat was probably the most surprised man in Boston. He examined Louis's trumpet, his money bag, his life-saving medal, his slate, and his chalk pencil. Then he asked Louis what he wanted. Louis wrote on his slate, "Have trumpet, need work." "Okay," said the boatman. "You've got yourself a job. A boat leaves here in 5 minutes for a trip around the lake. Your job will be to swim in front of the boat, leading the way and blowing your horn." "What salary do I get?" asked Louis on his slate. "We'll settle that later when we see how you make out," said the boatman. "This is just a tryout." Louis nodded. He arranged his things neatly around his neck, entered the water quietly, took up a position a few yards in front of the boat, and waited. He wondered what would make the boat go. He couldn't see any outboard motor, and there were no oars. In the forward part of the boat were benches for the passengers. In the stern was a structure that was shaped like a swan. It was hollow. Inside of it was a seat, like a bicycle seat, and there were 2 pedals inside, like the pedals of a bicycle. When the passengers were all aboard, a young man appeared. He climbed onto the stern of the boat and sat down on the seat inside the hollow swan-shaped structure and began to push the pedals with his feet, as though he were riding a bike. A paddle wheel began to turn. The boatman cast the lines off, and as the young man pedaled, The swan boat slowly moved out into the lake. Louis led the way, swimming with his left foot, holding his trumpet with his right foot. "Ca-honk," said Louis's trumpet. The wild sound rang loud and clear and stirred everyone's blood. Then, realizing that he should play something appropriate, Louis played a song he had heard the boys sing at camp. "Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream." The swan boat passengers were beside themselves with joy and excitement. A real live swan playing a trumpet. Life was a dream, all right. What a lark! What fun! What pleasure! So here he is playing his trumpet and leading the swan boat. "This is real groovy," cried a boy in the front seat. "That bird is as good as Louis Armstrong, the famous trumpet player. I'm going to call him Louis." When Louis heard this, he swam alongside the boat, took his chalk pencil in his mouth, and wrote, "That's actually my name." "Hey, how about that?" yelled the boy. "This swan can write, too. Louis can write. Let's give him a cheer." The passengers cheered loudly. Louis swam ahead again, leading the way. Slowly and gracefully, the boat circled the island while Louis played "Gentle on My Mind" on his trumpet. It was a lovely September morning, hazy and warm. Trees were beginning to show their autumn colors. Louis played Old Man River. When the swan boat docked and the passengers got off, long lines of people were waiting to get aboard for the next ride. Business was booming. Another boat was being made ready to accommodate the crowds. Everyone wanted to ride the swan boats behind a real live swan playing a trumpet. It was the biggest happening in Boston in a long time. People liked strange events and queer happenings, and the swan boat, with Louis out in front leading the way, suddenly became the most popular attraction in Boston. "You're hired," said the boatman when Louis climbed out onto the bank. "With you playing the trumpet, I can double my business. I can triple it. I can quadruple it. I can quintuple it. I can sextuple it. Anyway, I'll give you a steady job." Louis lifted his slate. "What salary?" he asked. The boatman gazed around at the crowds waiting to get aboard. $100 a week," he said. "I'll pay you $100 every Saturday if you'll swim ahead of the boats and play your horn. Is that a deal?" Louis nodded his head. The man seemed pleased but puzzled. "If it isn't too much to ask," said the boatman, "would you mind telling me why you're so interested in money?" "Everybody is," replied Louis on his slate. "Yeah, I know," said the boatman. "Everybody likes money. It's a crazy world, but, why would a swan need money? You can get your meals just by dipping down and pulling up tasty plants at the bottom of the lake. What do you need money for?" Louis erased his slate. "I'm in debt," he wrote. And he thought about his poor father who had stolen the trumpet, and about the poor storekeeper in Billings who had been robbed and whose store had been damaged. Louis knew he must go on earning money until he could pay off what he owed. "Okay," said the boatman, addressing the crowd. "This swan says he's in debt. All aboard for the next ride." And he began selling tickets. The boatman owned several boats, all of them shaped like a swan. Pretty soon every boat was full and money was flowing in. All day long the swan boats circled the lake, carrying their load of happy people, many of them children. Louis played his trumpet as he had never played it before. He liked the job. He loved to entertain people, and he loved music. The boatman was just as pleased as he could be. When the day was over and the boats had made their last trip, the boatman walked over to Louis, who was standing on shore arranging his things. "You've done great," said the boatman. "You're a good swan. I wish I'd had you long ago. And now, where are you planning to spend the night?" "Here on the lake," Louis wrote. "Well, I don't know about that," said the man uneasily. "An awful lot of people are curious about you. They might make trouble for you. Bad boys might hurt you. I don't trust the people who hang around the park at night. You might get kidnapped. I don't want to lose you. I think I'll take you across to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and get you a room for the night. It's clean and the food is good. It would be safer. Then I can be sure you'll come to work in the morning." Louis didn't think much of this idea, but he agreed to go. He thought, well, I've never spent a night in a hotel. Maybe it would be an interesting experience. So he walked along with the boatman. They left the park and crossed the Arlington Street and entered the lobby of the Ritz. It had been a long, tiring day for Louis, but he felt relieved to know that he had a good job and then he could earn money in Boston as a musician. Sounds like Louis had a very exciting day. So that's all for today, and we will pick up next time, and I can't wait to find out what happens next.